Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining Foley and Lardner for today's program titled Use and Distribution of the Vaccine, Are You Prepared? We are so happy you can join us today, and we sincerely apologize for the technical difficulties we encountered last week. If you have a question about any of today's topics, we invite you to type them into the Q&A widget on the left side of your screen. We will be answering any questions that come in at the end of the program during our full panel Q&A. If you experience any technical difficulties with the webinar platform, please refresh your browser or see the webcast help guide on your screen, which is designed with a question mark icon. A short survey will appear on the right side of your screen, and we would appreciate it if you would provide us with feedback on today's webinar to help us improve our future programs. Before I turn it over to our first presenter, I wanted to remind you that you can find all the latest news related to COVID-19 on Foley's Coronavirus Resource Center at foley.com/coronavirus. Today's presentation will include 5-minute breaks in between each presentation, so feel free to jump in and out of our program as you need. A full video presentation of today's program will be available on foley.com 24 to 48 hours following this program. And now I will turn it over to David Rosen, who will be kicking off our program. David?
Thank you very much. I'm Dave Rosen. I head the firm's FDA practice and co-chair the life sciences practice. I'm a pharmacist as well as an attorney, and I spent 15 years at FDA. So I'm going to try to provide some insight into the FDA process with respect to the vaccine. A couple things that we do know is, one is we've seen the numbers go way up over the last month. And so things, we have to be prepared for additional infections at this point. I don't believe that we have turned the corner. So I think that we still need to do the things that are appropriate to try to control the spread of the vaccines. We are not going to have a vaccine by tomorrow, by Election Day, but I do think that we are going to have a vaccine in the near future, hopefully by the end of the year. Whether or not it's us who are going to get that vaccine in the first tranche, or whether or not it's going to be other people who are more vulnerable patient populations, that's another story. But I do believe that we will have a safe and effective vaccine. As my colleagues and I were thinking about this, we said that we really wanted to make sure that everybody understood and had a good sense of what's going on with the vaccine, issues from the FDA perspective, from the healthcare provider perspective, from the supply chain, and from the distribution perspective. And so we've tried to put that together today. We also have a little bit of a presentation from our employment group, and that we will be having some additional webinars from the employment side in the near future too. So I wanted to bring that to everybody's attention. With that, I'm going to provide a little bit of overview because we have a bunch of people on the phone that may not understand or have the experience with the FDA process. So I wanted to make sure that you appreciated it as we move forward in this presentation. So again, on behalf of everybody here at Foley, we appreciate your coming back, and we apologize for the problems that we had with the first part of the webinar. So thank you, and I'm going to get started. So the standards for approval, is this the first? Yeah, it is. Okay, sorry. Is that a biologic license application, or BLA, that the product is safe, pure, and potent. Safety means it's free from harmful effects, and we want to make sure that our products that are out there in the marketplace are safe, without a doubt. Purity means that it has its freedom from extraneous matter, so we want to make sure that the product meets appropriate standards of identity, strength, quality, and purity at the time of use, so there's no deleterious or harmful excipient. And you see that people, you shouldn't take a vaccine if you're allergic to any of the components of the vaccine. That's kind of what they're talking about. And potency it means that the product is able to bring about the desired effect. And in this situation, it's to stimulate your immune system so that you get the appropriate antibodies to confer immunity from the infection, or to decrease the severity of the infection. You've heard a lot about emergency use authorization. And basically what this is, it allows the government to approve without full approval the use of a particular product to help strengthen national preparedness. And so it's a way to get products into the marketplace without having to go through a full approval process. We've seen, for example, with the COVID-19 tests, they've allowed products to get into the marketplace by providing verification and validation that the tests are specific and sensitive enough to provide reliable results. So that's the emergency use authorization, and FDA has done a nice job with that. They've done a nice job with making sure that the PPE is out there without going through a quote-unquote approval process. We've seen a few products that have gone through from a therapeutic point of view. We'll talk a little bit about remdesivir. That was one of the therapeutics, and the convalescent plasma is the other product that currently is available through emergency use right now from a therapeutic point of view. So it's something that we need to help with these types of pandemics during a national emergency. We've talked about this, about the emergency use of an unapproved medical product or approved use of an unapproved use of an approved product once there is a determination that there's a public health emergency or a threat justifying the authorization for emergency use of a product. What do we see? You know, what are we thinking about in terms of the kinds of data that we see in an emergency use authorization, or EUA? We're certainly looking at any relevant or any evidence from human experience regarding the activity or safety or effectiveness in public case reports, uncontrolled trials or controlled trials, and any other relevant human use. That's fairly important. What's in an EUA? The available scientific evidence. We talked a little bit about safety and effectiveness. If there's that, you have to have some indicia that the product is going to work in the particular use that is being purported. We have to have a full description of the product and the intended use. The description of the FDA approval process, approval status, you know, whether it's unapproved or whether it's an approved product for an unapproved use. Whether it's currently under investigational status at FDA, either under an investigational new drug application or under an investigational device exemption, which allows the product to be used in a clinical trial type of format. Whether the product is available and approved in a foreign country, the need for the product, and as I said, any available safety and effectiveness information, a discussion of the risks and benefits appropriate associated with the product, information on any of the manufacturing controls associated with that, any company or laboratory that's involved in the manufacturing, processing, testing, and control of the product, and whether or not they're in compliance with current good manufacturing practices and/or quality systems requirements to ensure that the products meet appropriate standards. Information on the availability of the product, how much is in hand, and how much the company can respond to increase manufacturing capabilities on very short notice. Some sort of instructions for use or package insert that provides information to practitioners how to use the product, as well as maybe some information to provide to patients to provide information on how to appropriately use the product, information on the stability and how to store, and that's going to be a big deal with these vaccines because they have very interesting storage conditions that are not as easy to deal with, as well as if there's any literature, if there's any right of references to that literature, or copies of any literature that would support the safety or effectiveness of the proposed product. So when I talk about safety, we really are talking about pharmacovigilance. We're looking at how we know that the product is safe over a period of time. And this is a very important aspect. So we can look at the detection, adverse assessment, and understanding of adverse events. And We need to be able to follow this because we don't have a lot of human experience, and once you open up products to a wide population, they have a lot of different underlying conditions, and we want to make sure that there's no serious or unexpected or life-threatening adverse events associated with a particular product once there's a significant increase in the exposure to a particular product. This is a signal. We're looking at a potential signal, so it's something that maybe gives rise to an indication that there's an issue, and then that needs to be fully evaluated and documented to determine whether or not it's a cause of concern, or whether or not the adverse event is associated with the product or it's an underlying condition of a particular patient, and it will contribute to the safe use of the product in the long run. Again, the signals indicate a need for further investigation and evaluation, and they need to be evaluated to determine whether it represents potential safety risk and whether or not other action needs to be taken, whether it's a warning, precaution, contraindication, a black box warning, or whether or not the product should be taken off the market. What's the U.S. regulatory definition of safety of a vaccine? 21 CFR means the relative freedom from harmful effects to persons affected directly or indirectly by the product when prudently administered in accordance with the labeling and in relation to the condition of the person receiving the product at the time. So really, we're looking at the impact of the product on a particular patient when it's administered or over the course of time, because some of these are delayed reactions too, or the first product would cause, the first injection or something like that might cause hypersensitivity or cause sensitivity, and then the second injection could give rise to an adverse event. So we have to be very careful, and we have to monitor this on a regular basis. As I said, vaccines present unique safety considerations that we have to really take into consideration, because we're talking about vaccinating millions of healthy people, including infants and children. And there's mandates for certain vaccines, and Mark Newberger will give you a little bit of discussion about that from the mandate situation, and that the individuals may have a very low risk for the disease, but we still want to vaccinate them anyway. We have not seen that in the case with COVID, but for other types of diseases, we've seen there's a potential low risk. But we do have a very low tolerance for vaccine-associated risk. That's the bottom line. Again, the vaccines are a little different because there's the active component, and then there's a preservative. There are adjuvants that help the vaccine work a little bit better. There's stabilizers, and there are manufacturing residuals that could be impurities or degradants in those vaccines and other products. And we want to make sure that none of those gives rise to a safety concern. We're learning a lot about these vaccines at this point in time. We're looking at whether or not they can be administered with other vaccines. We're looking at the dosing, whether it's an initial dose and a booster dose, or how long it confers immunity for, and what's the age bands that we should be doing this, and how we should be evaluating them. That's for sure. So we've seen a number of issues have arisen with vaccines. We've seen the J&J vaccine that was paused, for an adverse event, but it was reviewed by an independent data safety monitoring board, or DSMB, which is a group of independent physicians, as well as the company internal clinical and safety physicians. And we're looking at making sure that there's no adverse events. Companies pause trials when they see this out of an abundance of caution, and they do evaluate whether or not the product there's causation here. We haven't seen that in this situation, and the study resumed last week, or about 2 weeks ago now. So very nice that we have the controls in place, and that there are checks and balances with respect to these particular products to make sure that we do evaluate safety. Same thing with the AstraZeneca and the UK and the University of Oxford vaccine. Again, we've seen a significant issue. The adverse event was evaluated by the Medicines Health Regulatory Authority in the UK, as well as an independent DSMB, and they decided that the study was safe to resume. Very important. And, you know, again, people are looking very carefully and very closely at these things to ensure that we have continued evaluation of safety, because no one wants to compromise the integrity of the process, and they want to make sure that if and when these products come out, that they're very well characterized. That's for sure. We saw that the Eli Lilly study was paused. And we didn't know what the issue is. I think this study was actually discontinued fairly recently too. So I don't know if this is actually going to move forward here. I read something fairly recently that said that that a study was ultimately decided not to continue, and I think this might have been the product. I want to make sure that people understand that a pause in a trial is not a clinical hold. A clinical hold is something that the FDA imposes when human subjects would be exposed to an unreasonable and significant risk of illness or injury. And that could be with the product, it could be with the study design and things of that sort. And FDA doesn't impose a clinical hold lightly. It's something that is really important, and they have to justify to everybody why they imposed a clinical hold on a product that's under an IND or an IDE. Again, we see these pauses that come up because there's a potential safety signal, and we need to look at that. And then once there is a pause, there's a fair amount of checks and balances, including the independent DSMB, as well as the company internal teams evaluating what the causation and the risks are. And there is ultimately a determination as to whether or not the trial can resume. FDA had a advisory committee meeting related to vaccines and things of that sort, in terms of what are the data necessary to obtain approval of that. And it was very well attended and very lively discussions for sure. And what kind of data would be necessary to either have FDA approve an EUA or full approval? I don't think we're going to get full approvals. I think we're going to see an EUA for these particular products. Again, we have to see that in order for an EUA to be approved, it may be effective, and that we can characterize the known and potential benefits and compare them to the known and potential risks of the particular product. So we're looking, again, that balance of risk-benefit is really important, and it's one that people take very seriously, including, you know, the folks at FDA do, and I'm sure the companies do too, with respect to making sure that they want to put the best products out there that they possibly can. Again, we've seen the evaluation. We need to see data from at least one well-designed phase 3 clinical trial, okay, to demonstrate that the product is safe and effective in the particular patient population. And that FDA has said that that any assessment with respect to an EUA would be made on a case-by-case basis. And I think that's the right thing to do, to make sure that we evaluate these things on a product-by-product basis, and that we don't permit a product to be marketed unless it does meet appropriate standards of safety and efficacy. FDA has said that they want at least 2 months of safety data on at least half the trials before they would consider authorizing EUA of any coronavirus vaccine. Again, we're not going to see a vaccine tomorrow, and we're not going to see it by the end of the month. We'll start seeing data maybe by the end of the month or early in December. And I think that's the right thing to do, to be very, we have a pandemic, but we also want to make sure that these products meet appropriate standards and don't put people, at the risks, that the risks don't outweigh the benefits, or the benefits are much better than the potential risks associated with administering the products. And that's really important. Again, we're seeing companies out there talking about this, and that we're hoping to see data from companies, and that we'll see those data in a public setting so that there'll be a fair amount of scrutiny. A number of states have said that irrespective of what FDA does, they're going to convene independent committees to evaluate the data before they allow the vaccines to be utilized in their citizens of their states. I'm not fully in favor of that. I have a lot of respect for the integrity of the FDA review process, and I believe that the people at FDA are very dedicated to making sure that the products meet appropriate standards before they would authorize an EUA for anything for the American public. Again, we're likely to have enough safe and effective vaccines, hopefully sooner than later. We're cautiously optimistic. There's been a number of contracts that have been let for this, and I believe Mike Lockerbie is going to talk a little bit about those contracts and the distribution agreements, so I think that would be very helpful for us. There's a playbook, a CDC playbook with respect to jurisdictional operations for the vaccine that was put out. What we're seeing is that these vaccines are very temperature sensitive, and they need to be ultra cold storage, okay? And we're looking at the cold chain situations, and Vanessa Miller will talk a little bit about that. The issue with respect to storage is that they have to be appropriately stored to maintain the potency and purity of the product. In addition, you just can't take these vaccines out of the freezer, put them in the microwave, and heat them up. So we're going to have to make sure that the thaw cycle is appropriate for these particular products, and there's going to have to be controls in that situation to make sure that the products maintain their appropriate standards before they're administered to patients. And if things are frozen, then unfrozen and refrozen again, that all can impact the safety, purity, and potency of the vaccine. And so we want to make sure that there are appropriate controls in place at all your institutions and things of that sort to maintain the proper conditions for these products. You can see that we got remdesivir approved, the Gilead's product. It was received on August 7th and approved on October 22nd. So that's a fairly quick approval for FDA, which is great. And we're seeing that it should be administered in a hospital setting and 12 years above and things of that sort. So, I mean, FDA is working very hard, and this is a full approval, which is very nice. There are a lot of data and a lot of studies on this, and so it wasn't that FDA cut corners or things of that sort. They had a fair number of studies in different types of patient populations, which is great. And so this was a study that was started very early in the process. So, I'm very comfortable with this particular approval. And the thing that I will say about this is that when I looked at the approval letter for this, the post-marketing study requirements for this went on for about 6 pages. So they have a lot of work to do as a condition of approval of the product. So that's kind of where we are, but hopefully we'll see some additional therapeutics going through the IND and maybe a treatment IND if they have an indicia of safety and effectiveness, so that we can get some additional products out there in the marketplace. So with that, I want to thank everybody for paying attention for this first section. We're going to take a 5-minute break. And when we come back, my colleague Monica Shimoleski will talk a little bit about the healthcare setting and practitioners, some information for them. So again, thank you very much for your time and attention today, and we're going to take a 5-minute break starting now. Well, welcome back, everybody. Thank you for coming back. I want to introduce you to my friend and colleague, Monica Chmielewski, who is going to talk about provider vaccine planning and preparedness. Monica, take it away.
Hi, thank you, David, and thank you, everybody, and welcome. So David provided a lot of information about the vaccine and hopefully what's to come from an FDA perspective. So for the next 20 minutes, I'm going to focus on how to prepare for the vaccine, preparedness and planning, more from the provider side, from focusing more from hospitals, health systems, non-public institutions, I should say. So what we're going to touch upon is, thinking about vaccine, contracting and contract considerations, how you're going to obtain the vaccine, what are going to be the sources. Once you receive it, how are you going to store it? What are the requirements for storage and administration? David touched upon some of the requirements in terms of, temperature conditions, and so we're going to focus on that and how you can plan for that. Employee training considerations from receipt of the vaccine to who is permitted to administer it. And then we're going to look at consent requirements. And then finally, which is probably going to be the most relevant, shall we say, is going to be determining who gets the vaccine. Once you have it, how are you going to determine who it's disseminated to? So starting out, how are you going to receive the vaccine? There are numerous contracting sources that may or may not be available. Now, most hospitals, health systems, providers are members of a group purchasing organization, also known as a GPO. And it may be that if one of the manufacturers of the vaccine is a participant in your GPO, if they already have vendor contracts with the GPO that the provider is a member of, that may be one sourcing option for you. That would be, in some respects, a simple way to go in terms of contracting for and obtaining the vaccine, because the GPO would be the one that's negotiating the terms of the contract for the procurement of the vaccine. There may be that you are going to be engaging in direct contracting. Many hospitals and large health systems and providers we're seeing more and more are becoming very sophisticated in their contracting, and they often enter into direct contracts with the various manufacturers and distributors. And then there may be trying to look through a crystal ball, there may be government regulated distribution of the vaccine as well. Now, in cases where the hospital, the provider is going to be engaging in direct contracting, I want to focus on what are some of the things you need to think about when you're contracting with the provider, or with the manufacturer for the vaccine. Now, the odds are that most manufacturers are going to want their standard terms to apply. Again, we're seeing many providers and health systems, as their sophistication and contracting, is really, really, improving. They will have their own template terms and conditions that they often use to obtain medical devices and medical products. Here, due to the fact that this really is going to be a novel vaccine, I think that most manufacturers are going to require their own contract terms to apply. So what does that mean? What are going to be some of the key contract considerations, the terms that you need to think about, a provider needs to think about when they're contracting for the device? The first is going to be the availability of the vaccine. We don't know initially what the supply is going to be like. We'll discuss in a little bit. It's likely there will be probably a phased approach to the vaccine distribution availability, such as approach when it's in short supply initially, all the way to the end when hopefully it'll be available to all. But in terms of contracting, you're going to want to think about what terms can you put into the agreement to address the fact that you should receive ample supply of vaccines. Now, the manufacturers are going to want to put into the contract very common terms regarding their ability to either accept or reject purchase orders. For example, here are some sample provisions that we often see, that all orders are subject to acceptance by the manufacturer and their sole discretion. So what does that mean? If you have that type of a term in your contract, the manufacturer is going to have the ability to reject any of your purchase orders, and you may not receive the vaccine shipments that you're looking for. Manufacturers will often put in clauses that will allow them to either partially fill an order or perhaps redirect or reallocate their supplies amongst their customers. Example terms would include, if the supply is low, they may prohibit or restrict orders by customers, or that if, supply is low, or if there's potentially emergency condition, that they, reserve the right to reduce the order. So if you placed an order for a certain amount of vaccine, the manufacturer could say, we now have the right to reduce your order. They could decline the orders, or, there could be issues of back orders for the terms of the supply. I really, in the initial phases of the vaccine rollout, it's unlikely that there's going to be a lot of leverage that the providers have to negotiate and ensure specific quantities of the vaccine. What we recommend that you consider is in the direct contracts with the manufacturers that you put in clauses and language that require the manufacturers to provide you with ample notice. So if a manufacturer is going to be running low on a supply and it's unlikely to be able to fill all of the orders, consider having clauses in the agreement that will require the manufacturer to give you ample notice. That's really crucial because it's going to help you in terms of your planning. You're planning for accepting appointments for vaccinations, planning in terms of distribution, whether it's to employees or to other patients. You're going to need to know, what the availability of the vaccine is. So additional contracting considerations are going to be including shipment and risk of loss. The really considered to be the gold standards by providers is making sure that shipment is normally FOB destination, so that risk of loss and title doesn't actually pass to the recipient until the time they actually receive it. Now, what most manufacturers are going to want to see, though, is probably, FOB origin, where essentially, orders are shipped and risk of loss passes to the customer once the vaccine is actually placed with the carrier. Now, it may be that, the manufacturer will want to do FOB origin, but they would consider some type of insurance with it. If we recommend that when you're looking at shipping and risk of loss terms, you also consider adding in language addressing acceptance of the vaccine. And this is going to tie into your employee training. When you receive the vaccine, you're going to need to make sure that you have the ability to inspect it. So any shipments that come in, you're going to want to be able to look at it, make sure that it hasn't been contaminated, for example, that it's been shipped in the appropriate manner so that it has actually stayed temperature controlled. If you receive the vaccine and you do not have that right to inspect it, you may then have a product that is unusable. So it's important to consider putting in language and into the contract that allows you to inspect the vaccine once you receive it, make sure it conforms with the proper packaging, that it hasn't been contaminated, and that you have the right to reject it and receive new vaccine if once it's delivered it doesn't so conform. Tying into that is your employee training. You're going to need to make sure that your employees understand how the vaccine is supposed to be transported. They have to understand the storage conditions so that when it's received and they're looking to make sure that it actually conforms to all the specifications, that they know what they're looking for. Other contractual considerations include, warranties. Normally with products, health systems, providers, require a litany of warranties, mainly to make sure that the products are all safe, effective, and they're not defective in any way. Most standard warranties in terms of traditional supply chain agreements would include warranties of title and non-infringement, As I mentioned, warranties that the product has been manufactured in accordance with all applicable laws, including good manufacturing practices, a warranty against defects, a warranty of sometimes efficacy or fitness for a particular purpose. We see oftentimes that if a manufacturer is marketing a product for a specific use, that the provider will look for warranties that, if you're marketing for that use, the product will so conform and perform in accordance with that. And then, of course, warranties that any product that's provided has received FDA approval or FDA clearance if it's a device, or a pre-market approval. Again, due to the novel nature of the vaccine, it's very likely that providers should expect contracts to contain more limited warranties from the manufacturer. I think at a minimum, I would always push for warranties of title, and then warranties that the product is going to be manufactured in accordance with applicable laws and regulations, including, good manufacturing practices. And then probably the last big contract consideration I want to touch upon, other than customer obligations, which will be next, has to do with indemnity. Now, again, in most instances, in the normal course, GPO contracts and hospital provider direct contracts will include what we consider to be pretty standard indemnities that the manufacturer provides. Now, those include indemnity against intellectual property infringement claims, indemnity against negligence or failure to comply with laws, and then indemnity for products liability. Any issues that would arise based upon, the use of the vaccine, if it's contaminated, if it's defective, we normally look for indemnities, some type of assurances and protections, regarding the products, the vaccine that you're actually acquiring. Now, here again, it's going to be likely that indemnity is something that's heavily negotiated, and will probably be, manufacturers will look to have it limited. Along those lines, what we expect to see and what we commonly see in contracts for vaccines, especially like the influenza vaccine and others, is that the manufacturers will put obligations of the customer on the customer into the agreement. Placing, certain obligations on the customer, on the provider, really helps to, in some ways, serve to insulate the manufacturer against potential liabilities. So here are some, examples from a vaccine contract for the influenza vaccine. The obligations that the manufacturer put on the customer was that they represent and warrant that customers that administer the vaccines to patients warrant that they will take appropriate steps to ensure that all vaccine products purchased will only be administered by a licensed professional using the professional judgment, or they'll take all appropriate steps to provide the patient or their representative or guardian information on the risks and benefits of the vaccine in a form that is understandable to the patient. And we're going to talk about consent here in a minute. Two additional obligations that are often placed upon the customers is that the customers taking physical possession of the vaccines are fully responsible for complying with all applicable laws relating to the storage, handling, and distribution of the products, including laws applicable to controlled substances, if it's applicable, and that the customer represents and warrants that they will at all times maintain the proper license to receive and handle and store the vaccine. Now, that one is important because if you have language like that in a contract, you need to make sure that any of the obligation, the requirements for handling, storage, administration, the use of the vaccine, that you require the manufacturer to provide you with all of that information. They need to provide you with any information on how to store the vaccine, what the requirements are for administration. Because if you're going to rep and warrant in a contract that you're going to comply with all those requirements, you need to fully understand what they are and place the burden on the manufacturer to provide you with that information. a final customer obligation is that they will take all precautions necessary to prevent the vaccine essentially from falling into the hands of somebody who shouldn't have it. Now, David mentioned the temperature storage. Again, this is a sample from the influenza vaccine. This is not the COVID vaccine. But you need to understand and consider if a contract is requiring you, and it will require you to store the vaccine in accordance with applicable regulations and in accordance with the manufacturer specifications, you need to know what those are, and you need to understand, do you have the proper equipment? Do you have the proper storage and your refrigerator equipment to maintain the vaccine in that manner? Then you need to make sure that you understand what the implications of that are. As David mentioned, if you then take the vaccine out of like the refrigerator unit, the cold storage, how much time is needed for it to thaw, if that's the right word, to then be used with patients? Those are considerations that you actually are going to want to put into a protocol or some type of a SOP that you train your employees on and how to actually administer the vaccine. So going right into that, you really so you're contracting for the vaccine. Now you have to figure out, okay, where are we going to store it? Where is actually the storage facility? Where within my facility am I going to be able to store the vaccine? When it gets taken out of storage, where do I need to transport it to? Where within the facility? Who's going to be responsible for it? Who's going to be responsible for preparing the vaccine for actual administration? And then who are the people that are able to administer the vaccine? All of that is going to needs to be taken into consideration when you're scheduling appointments for the vaccine, whether it's to your workforce or whether it's actually to patients or the community. So what we're recommending and what we want, we recommend that, hospitals and providers think about is putting, SOPs in place. Determine who are your employees that are going to be responsible for each step of this process. Who's going to be responsible for, upon receipt of the vaccine, checking it for acceptance testing? And then once it is, transporting it to the storage unit. Then who's going to be responsible for removing it from the refrigerated storage unit when proper for use and preparing it? And then who's going to administer it? You then, once you have all the employees and everybody, their processes identified, you're going to want to make sure that everybody is trained on that SOP so that everybody understands what their role is and what they need to do. Now, the person who is administering the vaccine, or the people that are responsible for assisting perhaps the person who's going to administer the vaccine, getting the patient prepped, they need to be trained on not only how to administer the vaccine, but also about obtaining consent from the patient and basically obtaining records and documentation of the provision of the vaccine. Now, in terms of the consent process, and I apologize, I'm going through this rather quickly, but trying to cover a lot in a short amount of time here. Now, we understand, and it's common, that providers will have, your standard consent forms. You present at a physician's office, you present in the hospital, you are required to sign various consent forms, authorizations in relation to if you're going to have a surgical procedure performed, you have a HIPAA authorization, there's numerous. What we recommend considering, again, due to this being, a very novel circumstance, is that you have a separate and distinct consent form and authorization for the administration of the vaccine. Now, currently, there's no federal requirement for informed consent relating to immunization. So for state and local regulations, state and local regulations apply, and different health department, public health department rules and regs will apply. Now, it's pretty self-explanatory, why we recommend you obtain the consent, and really is to keep patients informed. Everyone should be aware of what the risk and the potential benefits of receiving a vaccine or any treatment are, and what could happen to them. Now, from the practical side, it can also help protect the providers potentially from potential liability. In some jurisdictions, a failure to obtain informed consent could create substantial liability for the physician, because what could happen is a lawsuit could allege that the provider failed to obtain consent in a legally sufficient way. And in many jurisdictions, that could actually be a form of malpractice. And then another example is a healthcare provider who fails to obtain consent could also be sued for negligent infliction of emotional distress. Essentially, the argument would be that the physician's negligence in not obtaining the consent form led to the patient's emotional distress. So a few reasons why we recommend consent. Now, when you do compose your consent, you're going to want to adhere to any specific state regulations for informed consent. Most states have their own regs about what has to be in it. Generally, you're going to need, demographics and health information. You're going to need information so that you can screen the person to make sure they're eligible for the vaccine. Now, with the flu, when you think about you sign a consent form in a local pharmacy to get an influenza vaccination, they ask, are you allergic to eggs? What is your health history? There's eligibility requirements for the vaccine. So we're going to need to understand what those are. Of course, it needs to be signed, and we recommend, to the extent possible, that you provide as much information on the vaccine as you can, and that you provide a vaccine information sheet. So essentially, that's a sheet that the patient takes with them after you have the vaccination, and it really should have additional information, again, very similar to what you have in the informed consent about the potential risks, the benefits, what you should do if there's an adverse reaction, et cetera. So we strongly recommend that those be provided. You can also consider having a waiver in the consent. Again, check with your state laws to understand, is a waiver permissible? This is a sample that was taken from a consent form for an influenza vaccine from a local pharmacy, where essentially you receive a waiver from the patient, the person receiving the vaccine, saying, look, I understand the potential risks and benefits. I assume those risks and benefits. I consent to this, and I fully release and discharge the provider from any damage or harm that I may incur from receiving the vaccine. This one goes on to say, address payment, they'll pay co-pays or deductibles. And this one actually says, I agree to wait in the vaccination area for approximately 20 minutes to receive treatment in case of an adverse reaction. I highlight this because as you're administering the vaccine, you're going to need to consider, one, what are the eligibility requirements, and two, what are the record-keeping requirements, and are there any requirements for people to be observed for a certain amount of time after they receive it? Because all of that's going to impact it. Okay, so finally, who's going to get it? And this is a big issue to consider. When you have a supply of the vaccine, the odds are that in the beginning it's going to be a limited supply. So providers need to right now plan for what is going to be your dissemination protocol. Who's going to get it first? And how are you going to figure this out? So what you can look to are your state laws, the CDC guidelines that David mentioned, and then there's been some ethical considerations as well that we'll talk about. So many states have vaccination laws really that relate to influenza, and it may be prudent to look to those state laws as a potential indication for how our state's going to regulate the vaccine, the COVID vaccine. So many states will require it. Others will provide that the providers have to make it available to people. And again, this can be something that you look to for guidance. For example, in Illinois, I'm here in Illinois, and we have a law that essentially says healthcare providers, each healthcare setting shall ensure that all healthcare employees are provided education on the vaccine and offered an opportunity to actually receive it. So there's a very broad definition of what constitutes a healthcare setting and what constitutes a healthcare employee. And it includes volunteers in the hospital, housekeeping, physicians, nurses, and then the definition of a healthcare setting is very broad as well. So in this case, in Illinois, a health system is required to make the vaccine available to their employees. And Mark, later on, going to talk about, can you require your employees, receive a vaccine? If that's the case and laws are enacted in relation to COVID, you're going to need to make sure that you have enough supply to try and comply with the laws. But that can be used as a guidance. So the CDC has put out guidelines that you can consider when looking at your dissemination practices for this, and they've really looked at a three-phase approach, with phase 1 being with a very limited supply, phase 2 there is a more general, and phase 3 where it is available to the whole public. In phase 1, they really focus on critical populations, which essentially is critical infrastructure workforce, healthcare professionals, and then other essential workers. People also in phase 1 would be people increased risk for severe COVID illnesses, and then people with limited access to routine vaccination services. The thought being that after phase 1, you identify the critical vulnerable populations first, provide the vaccine, and then in phase 2, as it becomes more available, more widespread dissemination. In relation to this, as you're trying to decide, there's been a lot of discussion and debate and scholarly articles regarding ethical issues associated with determining how you disseminate initial vaccines, including looking at well-being and the promotion of the common good, justice, fairness, and equality, making sure that, it may be unfair to do a first come, first serve approach to this. And then again, prioritizing those who are at increased risk in order to provide essential services. This really tracks with the CDC guidelines in terms of providing initial vaccines to healthcare workers, essential workers, those at increased risk, with the thought that that will help those people keep, the rest of the population healthy, the economy going, so that we can then vaccinate others. So last thing to consider is just planning overall. We recommend that you plan, like I said, develop SOPs in place regarding the receipt of the vaccine, the storage, how you're going to administer it. Think about your contracting considerations, train employees on your established SOPs, develop a patient consent form, and then determine what are you going to do with your employees. Are you going to have any mandated employee vaccination requirements? And then determine the tiers of administration. And again, Mark will talk about, if you can require your employees to be vaccinated. So again, apologies that this was super fast and it was a lot of information to take in, but I hope we found that helpful, and we can answer questions later on at the end of the live question and answer. But right now we are going to take a 5-minute break, and we will reconvene, probably a 3-minute break. We will reconvene at noon. Thank you very much.
Well, welcome back, everybody, and welcome to anybody new who's attending. Thank you for coming back on board with us. I want to emphasize that we will be having a live Q&A session at about 1 o'clock. About an hour from now, about 1 o'clock for about a half an hour. So please submit your questions through the Q&A section on the webinar, and we will be happy to respond to your questions, that's for sure. So it's my pleasure to introduce another friend and colleague, Vanessa Miller, who's going to talk about the supply chain and maintaining the continuity of supply, because that's really important. Vanessa?
Thank you, David. Well, we've heard today about certain considerations that companies need to be implementing and planning for with regard to the vaccines themselves. But what I want to focus on is a bit broader than that, and that is other areas deeper in the supply chain that are going to be impacted by the distribution of the vaccine, the manufacture of the vaccine. So what are we talking about when we say the supply chain? What's included? And it's very broad. We're talking about the entire supply chain as all physical aspects, including raw materials and equipment involved in the manufacture of the vaccine. Not just the active ingredient formulation that Monica covered, but beyond that, certain raw materials and inputs necessary for equipment. And then also any product that's related to manufacturing, storage, shipping, distribution. So it's not just for the vaccines themselves, but also anything tangential to the vaccines. That would include vaccine handling. For example, depending upon the ultimate formulation of the vaccine, there likely will be special glass vials that are going to be required for storing and transporting the vaccines at extremely cold temperatures. Similarly, there may be special gloves for equipment handling that are going to be needed and need to be produced and ordered. In addition, specially designed boxes and packaging materials, and then all of the raw materials and subcomponents for each of those items. For cold chain transportation and storage, we've already touched on the special refrigerators and deep freezer equipment that's going to be needed, coolers, dry ice and dry ice machines, but then also all of the inputs into that equipment. Temperature monitoring. It's going to be critically important. These vaccines are going to be monitored with GPS tracking devices. They're going to also include temperature monitoring that's going to alert the recipient if the temperatures had dropped below a certain level, making the vaccines unusable. So then any components needed for those tracking devices and embedded software for those devices. And then finally, some additional considerations such as generators that will be important for companies to have and backup batteries. And then even down to the labels that are going to be adhered to the packages as these are shipped, stored, transported, et cetera. So looking first at the area of shipping and logistics, some of the key hurdles that the supply chain are going to encounter we're already starting to see some of them play out. There has been a shipping capacity. Air cargo capacity has shrunk. Ships are elevated. Shipping costs via air are elevated and via ground are expected to rise as well. Although pharmaceutical companies and healthcare companies may have been thinking about these things and well prepared and already entered into contracts, looking further down the supply chain, that might not be the case with equipment providers and other component manufacturers. There's also going to be at the same time as there's this need to distribute the vaccine, assuming that one will be available in hopefully in the next few months, there's going to be competition with some of the highest volumes of shipping we've ever seen around the holiday season. And then, of course, airports need to be certified to specially handle pharmaceuticals, so that may create some additional bottlenecks in the supply chain. So what are some key contractual considerations for logistics companies in the vaccine distribution supply chain? What should they be considering? First is 3PL contracting, third-party logistics contracts. Some key areas outlined here: exclusivity and volumes. One of the most important influencing factors on logistics costs is, of course, volume. However, it's often very difficult to predict volumes and then timing. So some contracts will contain an exclusivity provision, which is the right of a logistics provider to the full volumes, all of the volumes of the shipper. But some contracts also may set forth minimum volumes in order to provide some kind of certainty or some kind of floor threshold to guarantee that they're going to be able to hit their targets and price downs. But consider for third-party logistics that are tied to the vaccine distribution supply chain, should there also be a need maximum figure? Meaning, is there some volume of shipping over which you cannot agree to as the third-party shipping provider that you will not be able to fulfill or meet? So at least have some threshold where you can use an alternate company if there are issues with shipping and logistics due to massive increases or decreases in demand. The next area for liability is liability for direct and indirect damages. Typically, 3PL providers are going to want to build in, when you're contracting with a 3PL provider, you're going to want to build in penalties for late shipments, or at least allocate who is responsible for damage to shipments and under what circumstances. Logistics providers may seek to limit damages by excluding certain categories of damage altogether, such as indirect or consequential damages, or another way is we will sometimes see damages caps included so that risk can at least be mitigated to quantify what the maximum risk would be in the event of an issue. A third key area in 3PL agreements is to include KPIs, key performance indicators, that tie to the right to switch providers if the targets are not met. Finally, there's been a lot of focus lately on price indexing provisions. And the reason is to build in some kind of price indexing provision is that you want to maintain the value of the contract despite market level price fluctuations. It really serves as a mechanism for the parties to recalibrate their pricing at periodic intervals during the course of a long-term agreement. When we typically see this as an annual exercise, although different periods may want to be included on 3PL agreements involving the vaccine supply chain. Okay, turning now to some key contract considerations for the sale of goods and materials to be in the vaccine supply chain. So there's key risks in shipping and logistics that can and absolutely should be negotiated at the front end between the parties, which includes freight expedites. Determine which party is going to be responsible in the event a freight expedite is required, which might be incredibly expensive if it's outside the regular shipping mechanism that the parties have agreed upon. And who is going to be responsible, what shifts the risk. Have a really clear agreement as to who's going to ultimately pay, even if it's a different party that has to arrange for the shipment in the first place. And this is really important to avoid claims of consignee liability in the event that the party that should be paying for the expedited freight refuses to or is unable to arrange some alternate shipper. Okay, as we've already issues and considerations that need to be navigated. Health officials have reported that the vaccine is going to need to be maintained at very low temperatures, even as low as negative 80 degrees Celsius, or the shots might be ruined in transit. So there are additional challenges given these extremely cold temperatures, as well as the fact that doses might need to be given a certain period of time apart, either 21 or 28 days apart. Consider also that planes, trucks, warehouses, anyone involved in transporting these and storing them needs to be outfitted with special deep freeze units to maintain the temperature. While we know that there are already contracts underway for certain technologies and storage equipment, this is going to impact the entire supply chain. Manufacturers and their sub-suppliers for this type of equipment are going to need to fill massive orders, and they're going to need to do it on a rush basis pretty quickly. Yet, they're also going to need to ensure these specially designed freezer units or refrigeration units are properly calibrated to maintain those temperatures and that they work properly once they're delivered to the location. So some of this equipment is going to require on-site testing and calibration with technicians, special technicians needed to be flown out to visit those sites. Other suppliers and materials that will be strained are going to include things like beyond the vials and the syringes that the healthcare companies are prepared for. But to the extent that the vials need to be made of specially manufactured glass, we've already been hearing about a shortage with respect to the raw materials needed to manufacture those glass vials. And then we talked about the specially designed gloves that will be needed. In addition, another major area of concern is dry ice. I started looking into this a bit more, but carbon dioxide is needed to make dry ice, and carbon dioxide in the summer of 2020 was in high demand and in short supply. There are already been shortages in the medical industry, even before we're trying to distribute this vaccine, and dry ice has been difficult to come by. So there's a number of shipping companies, including FedEx and UPS, that are looking to add machines that can produce dry ice on site. But what about the equipment manufacturers for those machines? Are they ready to receive orders for record-breaking rush orders of these dry ice machines? And then also the specially designed transportation containers and boxes, and looking all the way down the supply chain that's going to have these GPS and tracking devices included. Are their sub-suppliers prepared to fill the need and to fill the pipeline of orders? Some additional contract considerations related to cold chain issues. Obviously, all the parties involved in the manufacture, storage, transportation, and sale of the frozen products are going to have to really closely monitor and track the temperature data and related inventory. So it's important to allocate risk properly across the cold chain shipping, the cold chain supply chain. So there's so many areas, unfortunately, where a potential breach can occur. You need to look beyond just spoilage of the inventory and actually allocate risk based on causation. Not who had it at the time, but which party is responsible for the breach in the supply chain. Monitoring devices might fail, packing devices may be defective, shipping delays can occur, causing otherwise fine materials and to malfunction. And then, of course, human error or contamination issues that might occur while in transit, as well as loading and unloading, issues at warehousing, damage to containers as these are being shipped. So really thinking through all of this, looking across the supply chain, the various providers, and then making sure that risk flows through the supply chain properly. And making sure that the risk ties to some defect or failure on the part of your company, not just that you have possession of it when the issue was discovered. Another area that companies should be giving consideration to is sourcing and transparency. Now, it may not always be possible to qualify more than one source for a particular product or component. There may already be, for example, requirements contracts in place, and the supplier may insist on having a requirements contract. Requirements contract is an agreement in which the parties do not specifically state the exact amount of the product that's going to be supplied. Instead, like contracts, they rely on all of the volumes, 100% of the volumes, in order to drive down the costs on the supplier's side and to give the lowest piece price for a certain product. And these are really important in contracts for specially manufactured custom components and goods, such as we're going to see in the supply chain, and in a number of industries use them, such as manufacturing and certainly healthcare. One way to expand or one way to mitigate risk in the supply chain is to move away from sole sourcing and look at options to qualify a dual supplier if that's available as an option. Certainly that's one of the lessons learned from the pandemic and companies were experiencing issues with that back in March, where they were relying on a single company for all of their needs, and there was an issue in that company's supply chain and they could not source product. Source parts and materials, as long as it does not tip the scale too much in terms of pricing or cost, because that still is going to be one of the most important considerations in manufacturing. However, it is an additional backdrop in the event of threats to continuity of supply, which can include force majeure type events, troubled supplier issues, quality issues, or even higher volumes that the company can't fill. Some contract considerations now related to sourcing and transparency. Certainly some of the things that we learned from the pandemic and that we're seeing companies begin to implement in their own supply chains. Considering dual sourcing as an option, if you can do it, and the timeline that would be required to do it. Also requiring additional transparency into your supplier and their suppliers' supply chains. Things like supply chain mapping, built-in audit rights, and reporting requirements so that you get real-time information as to not just the one tier below you, not just your direct contracted sub-supplier, but what their supply base has on hand, what their capacity is, so that you know and have transparency into possible issues and bottlenecks. Also defining a volume threshold, maximum and minimum. Typically contracts only talk about a minimum volume requirement because the company wants to provide and supply as much as it can to make money. But where there might be massive volume fluctuations or the volumes are just really hard to estimate and the timing of those needs, companies might want to consider both protections, which will really serve as a bookend to ensure that the supplier's outputs and the orders that will be placed with that supplier fall within certain parameters that the supplier is capable of maintaining. And then if the volumes fall outside of the maximum, then you can turn to another supplier and to fill those orders. Also consider allocating risk for overtime, expedites, and anything else that we anticipate might be required due to volume surges. And then which party is going to be responsible for paying for those expedites and under what circumstances. Obsolescence. This is critically important and sometimes not really considered until the point in time when the parties are terminating or exiting their supply agreement. But looking down your supply chain and considering what your own ordering requirements are from your supply base, what amount of obsolescent parts or raw materials should the buyer be responsible for in the event of a cancellation or termination of the contract? What amount of material are you going to have on hand, particularly if you're trying to ensure continuity of supply and accepting the risk for certain situations? How much would you want the buyer to reimburse you for if the contract ends and if it ends abruptly, such that you can't use up your materials? And then finally, consider separate purchase orders for things like tooling and other capital expenditures that may be required to ramp up for what's likely going to be increased production in certain areas of the supply chain. Oftentimes, particularly where there's a right to terminate for convenience by the buyer, just including an amortization through piece price is not going to be protection enough. This is particularly true if there's no corresponding volume minimums. You might want to have at least a separate payment requirement if the contract ends early. Okay, warehousing and inventory. Many manufacturers now are moving away from a traditional just-in-time model and looking at other inventory protections. We've seen a massive uptick in warehousing requirements and companies looking at reserving warehousing space since the pandemic. The just-in-time inventory model, of course, is excellent. It's lean manufacturing aimed at reducing times within the production system and reducing costs because it aligns orders for materials and components with the buyer's production schedules. so that raw materials can be delivered sometimes within days or even hours of when they're going to be incorporated into a product or assembly. But we found with COVID that that just doesn't provide as much protection as may be needed in this current state, in the current supply chain. And that then any issues that occur anywhere in your supply chain or your sub-suppliers with your sub-suppliers and their supply chains can have a ripple effect and cause major issues. So many companies now are considering warehousing, inventory banking to make sure that their supply chain is more flexible. Some key contract considerations related to warehousing include things like having a bank of parts available on hand. Now that can be at your site or at some warehouse off-site. Of course, you need to consider how much inventory to bank, balancing that against the additional costs to have a bank of parts available or raw materials available, or paying the warehousing costs, whether the goods are perishable, and how frequently the inventory is going to need to be replenished. Now, there's also the option of shifting the burden of banking and warehousing to the supply base, such that you might require your supplier to have a bank of parts on hand at the supplier's facility. You might require the supplier to have a bank of parts on hand at a warehouse off-site so that you can still access those parts, even if there's some other issue. So there has been a renewed focus on force majeure. I think I talked about force majeure before it was cool to talk about force majeure, if it ever became cool to talk about it. But it's a critically important clause. It's always been one of the red flag provisions that I recommend in manufacturing contracts. And we certainly saw that play out at the beginning of the pandemic, and it's continuing as it's ongoing. So force majeure refers to circumstances outside of a party's control that excuse performance. It's not a breach. So a party that properly exercises force majeure is not in breach. Instead, it's just it's a pause in the party's contract. And it's a creature of contract. So if you want force majeure rights, you have to spell them out in the contract. Here's some content of force majeure, and you will see these listed in contracts under boilerplate miscellaneous provisions. But you see I have COVID-19 there in red. And that is because since the pandemic is underway and currently ongoing, it certainly should be something that companies are talking about. If there's an upwards trend in positive cases, further executive orders may be issued. And whether or not a supplier technically qualifies as essential, it's going to be on an order by order basis, and it's going to be a lot of confusion around it, just like there was last time. And maybe the sub-supplier, maybe you think that you're an essential business, but your sub-supplier doesn't agree or has heightened restrictions. So it's important to consider this. Do we want COVID-19 included in these contracts for the supply chain related to vaccine distribution or not? And if not, we need to expressly carve it out and say the pandemic is underway, we're going to allocate risk. So here's just some high level of when you draft a force majeure provision, you really need to not only define what constitutes a force majeure, but then say what the party's rights are in the event that a force majeure has been exercised. And that's going to really depend on the product at issue, the regions at issue, et cetera. So there's a natural tug of war between what a buyer might want included in a force majeure provision for a supply chain contract versus a seller. But necessarily, they're typically the flip side of each other. So here's a list of some key strategies that the buyer may employ, which is really streamlining and narrowly listing the events, excluding things that are outside of they're within the control of the supplier as the employer, like labor strikes, making sure there's prompt notice, and then shortening the time to resume performance. Of course, if your sub-supplier can't get back running, having the right to terminate the contract and replace that supplier after a certain time period so that you're not stuck trying to fill spot buys and paying an extremely much more expensive price You can go negotiate good volumes with a new supplier. And then it's the flip side for the seller strategies. You want broader list of force majeure events, performance suspended until the end of the force majeure event is over. And then finally, one last point is to consider how you want to allocate additional risks that may occur if there are more shutdowns, if there is an issue with continuity of supply. For example, things like warehousing costs, return costs, if your product has already been shipped out and then it needs to be shipped back because the facility you're shipping it to has been shut down due to an executive order or some other shutdown issue, who's responsible for paying? Freight expedites and absenteeism in the event that the facility needs to shut down because of a positive COVID case or feared COVID case. So there's just going to be a more intense focus going forward on the supply chain and their rights as to how those risks to be allocated contractually. Now we're going to have a break until 12:30 Eastern, and then we'll resume in about 4 minutes. Thank you.
Well, thank you everybody for coming back. We're trying to keep this running smoothly and on time. I want to remind everybody to continue to send in some questions. We will have a live Q&A session after the next presentations. And so with that, I'm going to send it over to my colleague, Mike Lockerbie, who's going to talk about distribution, pricing, and the middleman. Mike?
Thank you, David. I am co-chair of Foley's National Distribution and Franchise Practice Group, working out of the Washington, D.C. office, with the operative words these days being out of, although that was actually true before the pandemic for other reasons. In any event, when I heard the topic, distribution, pricing, and the middleman, I thought I could do this in my sleep, because after all, I've been advising clients about antitrust and related distribution issues and litigating such issues nationwide for the past 36 years, ever since I was a toddler. And also, some of you may know that our Distribution and Franchise Practice Group just finished presenting its 29th annual Law of Product Distribution and Franchise Seminar. That's an event that devotes a full day to many of the same issues that I will be covering today in only about 25 minutes. Or I thought they would be the same issues, because as it turns out, as you're about to see and hear, many of the distribution issues associated with the COVID-19 vaccine are likely to be very different than those related to the distribution of pharmaceuticals, medical supplies, and products in general. Sorry. No matter who is talking about COVID-19, whether it's a public health specialist, a doctor, a reporter, or a politician, whether the politician be Democrat, Republican, or independent, liberal, or conservative, the one word that I think we always hear mentioned in the same breath as COVID-19 is novel. The way the distribution channel for COVID-19, for the vaccine, is shaping up, it promises to be as novel, or almost as novel, as the vaccine, or as the virus rather, itself. So although I'll spend a little bit of time talking about more traditional distribution models, it now seems virtually certain that such models will not be used here, at least not with the first vaccine or vaccines to be approved. Rather, the CDC has announced that distribution is going to be similar to that used for the vaccine for the H1N1 virus, commonly known as swine flu. So I'm going to spend a fair amount of time addressing what the swine flu vaccine distribution system looked like without putting any lipstick on what some have called a pig, and also how that compares to what looks like the COVID-19 vaccine distribution system will be. I'm also, however, going to address a what-if scenario, and I think that's prudent to do because of the rapidity of the vaccine development process, the number of developers, all of which we hope will succeed. So that scenario could arise if there are multiple vaccines approved in multiple countries. And if so, that raises the question, will the CDC program be the only distribution channel in the US? Traditionally, of course, most pharmaceuticals and medical supplies have been sold through sales representatives and independent distributors. And in a traditional model, introducing a new product raises legal issues, first of all, under pre-existing agreements, second, under so-called relationship statutes that are in effect in various states, and we'll talk about more of those a little later. And finally, under antitrust law, one issue is exclusivity, and whether the sales rep or distributor can be required to sell exclusively the manufacturer's product, and also whether the distribution rights are exclusive. There are also issues of resale price maintenance oftentimes, and sometimes price discrimination. But again, the channels of distribution and legal issues are likely to be very different with the COVID-19 vaccine. To appreciate why, I think a little bit of historic context might be in order. The closest analogy to the COVID-19 pandemic occurred more than 100 years ago. And of course, it's commonly known as the Spanish flu, even though it didn't originate in Spain. And it was probably less severe in Spain than many other countries, one reason being that Spain was neutral in World War I. At that time, there was no vaccine. There were no antiviral drugs. And in fact, the very existence of viruses would not even be discovered until the 1920s, after the pandemic was over. There were some important differences between the Spanish flu and the novel coronavirus, one being that young people seem to be more adversely affected, and also the virus, by all accounts, seems to have been relatively more lethal. But even though medical science has progressed quite a bit in the last 100 years, more than 100 years, the response, masks, quarantines, and shutting down public places was not that much different than what we've seen with COVID-19. Now, if you fast forward to 2009, that was the height of the H1N1 swine flu or pandemic. That was less severe than either the Spanish flu or coronavirus. By comparison, with our current situation, 12,469 Americans died of it in 2009. There was a vaccine developed, and it was distributed directly by the CDC through the pre-existing Vaccines for Children program. And there seemed to have been some benefits of doing it that way. I mean, for example, there's an NIH report that we'll see on the next slide, but that report says that several participants noted that healthcare providers and clinics that participated in the Vaccine for Children program found it easier to participate in the 2009 H1N1 vaccination campaign because they were already familiar with the system. For better or worse, this will be the model, it looks like, for the COVID-19 vaccine distribution. And that raises the issue, what lessons were learned or should have been learned from that experience? In a lot of ways, in fact, in most ways, it looks as if the distribution model will be virtually the same. The H1N1 vaccine distribution campaign was funded by the federal government. The supply was allocated to states by population. I'm not sure that we know yet whether that will be the case here. Obviously, the severity of the virus has not always varied by population. And there was one common denominator. There was a single distributor that shipped directly from the CDC, and that distributor was McKesson, as we'll see in a little bit. Once the vaccine got to the states, however, the state distribution plans varied. There were some states that relied upon a combination of state and local public health authorities, private healthcare providers, and pharmacies. Some relied on local health departments, and there was also redistribution in some places by the state government directly to those administering the vaccine. And the verdict is mixed on how well that worked out. I mean, for example, the NIH report that you see up on the screen concluded that the diversity in distribution approaches meant that neighboring jurisdictions often had different distribution systems. This caused confusion and communications challenges, some participants noted, typically, or especially rather, in states in which each local health department developed its own distribution plan. And then layered upon the state distribution plan, or actually more accurately in parallel track, there was also distribution through the Department of Defense and Indian tribes. There have been, in addition to the NIH report, a number of news reports, both at the time and recently, about how well that worked out. And the consensus seems to be that in general, it was really too little too late. Now, part of that reflected shortages based upon the manufacturing process, but the bottom line was that the vaccine really wasn't widely available until after the second wave of the virus in the US in 2009. And by then, interest in getting the vaccine, it wasn't mandatory, had waned. CDC's use of a central distributor did get the vaccine to states quickly, but redistribution varied after that. And various miscommunications and delays led to a drop in public confidence. I mean, just for example, there was a Gallup poll in early November 2009, and 54% of adults surveyed said the federal government was doing a poor job or a very poor job of providing the country with an adequate supply of the H1N1 vaccine. We hope, obviously, we all hope that that won't be the case here. The current distribution strategy is laid out in what the government has published in its description of Operation Warp Speed, the current distribution strategy. Now, granted, the terms warp speed and the government are not normally used in close proximity to one another, but it certainly is the case that warp speed has been the rate at which the federal government has sought to spur the development and approval of the vaccine here. And it's also the hope that distribution will proceed quickly and efficiently once the vaccine is approved. And there are three key elements of the distribution model. The first one is similar to what I described with the H1N1 vaccine, in particular partnerships with state and local health departments and the like to allocate and distribute vaccines, sometimes augmented by direct distribution to commercial partners. The second point, the centralized distribution contract, that's the same one we were talking about earlier. In fact, it's basically the same contract with the same provider. And then there's supposed to be an IT vaccine tracking system to administer ordering, uptake, et cetera. Hopefully the bugs have been worked out of that, but that remains to be seen. Again, the CDC's existing distribution contract with McKesson under the Vaccines for Children program has an addendum that allows its use during a pandemic. It was used to distribute H1N1, and it's going to be used to distribute the COVID-19 vaccine as well. In addition to the McKesson contract, there are form agreements to be used with authorized redistributors compared to most distribution contracts with which I'm familiar, mercifully short, and that's probably a good thing under the circumstances. But this raises the question, in fact, will the CDC control all distribution? Reportedly, and David alluded to this, multiple researchers are working in multiple countries to develop a vaccine. The first to secure FDA approval will presumably be distributed through CDC distribution channels. What about other vaccines that are later approved? Will the CDC also distribute those, and could there be for-profit distribution of other approved vaccine products? And if so, and again, this is speculation, but we're all speculating at this point, some of the more traditional issues faced in distribution will come into play. The first and foremost one, of course, will be a contractual issue. And will existing sales reps and distributors have rights under the pre-existing contracts to sell these vaccines? That answer will depend upon how the contract is worded whether it's limited by product or brand, and whether and how the vaccine is branded. We also, though, have the overlay of state distribution laws. There's a map available. The URL is on the screen that we maintain. It's an interactive map. It allows you to see by state what statutes may apply to the distribution of your company's products. And these may restrict the supplier's ability to cut out the middleman. I mentioned exclusivity as being one issue. Under federal antitrust law, exclusive dealing agreements are typically going to survive scrutiny under the rules in Sherman Act Section 1. And for decades, the Supreme Court has viewed such restrictions as being pro-competitive because they enhance inter-brand competition vis-a-vis other manufacturers. Typically, state distribution laws do not prohibit exclusive dealing. However, there are state law prohibitions against coercion not to purchase competing products. However, the way those are typically interpreted by the courts, they're not violated simply by enforcing exclusivity requirements. This presentation was billed as discussing pricing the middleman, and to the extent that products are sold by independent distributors rather than sales reps, that raises the issue of resale price maintenance. More often than not, manufacturers are concerned about discounting that might commoditize a brand, jeopardize investments in R&D, manufacturing and distribution. But over the last century, the evidentiary burden to prove resale price maintenance has increased. It's a pretty high bar. And then in 2007, in the Legion case, the Supreme Court abandoned the rule that minimum resale price maintenance is always per se unlawful. That doesn't mean it's not problematic. There are states that have expressly disavowed following this precedent, and there have been successful cases under Legion, and so most companies, rather than absolutely prohibiting discounting, will use methods such as suggested resale prices, so-called Colgate programs, or minimum average pricing policies to avoid violating Sherman Act Section 1. With the coronavirus vaccine, however, it's more likely to be the case that manufacturers might be concerned about distributors charging more than suggested resale prices. We've seen that already with some of the PPE that has been distributed during the pandemic, and charging more than maximum suggested prices, known pejoratively as price gouging, may be of even greater concern. Federal antitrust law, however, has been clear for decades that maximum resale price maintenance does not violate Sherman Act Section 1. And so many companies can and do expressly prohibit it. And there's some contractual language on the screen that we've prepared that would allow you, if you're a manufacturer or other supplier, to control maximum resale price maintenance, maximum resale prices rather, consistent with what the Sherman Act allows. And the final antitrust issue that typically arises under distribution models is price discrimination under the Robinson-Patman Act. And the Robinson-Patman Act frankly doesn't make any sense. And everyone who's looked at it says that, Republican, Democrat, there have been calls for its repeal for decades, and yet it's on the books. And it was originally enacted to protect small mom and pop grocery stores from A&P. That tells you how old it is, but it is still on the books. And when you have distributors that compete with one another, it can present some hurdles and some challenges, because if you have two distributors that compete, you generally can't discriminate in price. And of course, in the marketplace, in the real world, product that is the same chemically, but has a different trademark is a different product. But under Supreme Court precedent, a product that is the same is considered to be of like grade and quality, even if it's branded differently. That doesn't eliminate a plaintiff of the burden of proving infringement competition. And again, that's not an issue if you have distributors that don't compete with one another, but they often do. There are various defenses that the statute recognizes. One is a cost justification defense, and there may be certain distributors that perform various functions, storage, warehousing, whatever, that others don't. There's also a functional availability defense that if, at least in theory, and hopefully as a practical matter, other wholesalers can avail themselves of the discount, is not going to run afoul of Robinson-Patman. And then finally, there's a statutory defense for meeting but not beating competition, and that's sometimes more difficult to establish. Looks like I haven't, sorry. It's more difficult to establish than one might think, and yet, although we always advise our clients not to exchange pricing information, typically our clients know what their competitors' prices are, and they know that by virtue of their customers who are trying to get better pricing. So through that process, it may well be able, manufacturer may well be able to avail itself of the meeting competition defense. Again, it's by no means clear that these issues are going to arise in the context of distributing the COVID-19 vaccine. They would almost always arise under a traditional distribution model, and they may yet arise if there's more than one distribution channel, and one of those is the more traditional model rather than the COVID-19 vaccine model that seems to have been chosen for now. I'm not going to make any predictions as to what's likely to happen. I'm probably as likely to be wrong as people forecasting election results, and my predictions would be a lot less scientific. So with that, we're at the conclusion of the distribution and pricing segment. We're going to take another break before my partner, Mark Neuberger, takes over. Thank you.
Can you hear my mic?
Yes.
Okay, no concerns.
I was saying either you're very stoic or you're frozen, but then you started moving.
Well, welcome back, everybody. We have one last speaker, our colleague Mark Newberger, down from a hotspot in sunny southern Florida. Mark's going to give us a little teaser into what we can consider from an employment point of view, and then we're going to move right into a Q&A session and a general discussion. So I encourage everyone to submit questions, and we will try to respond to everybody and have a general discussion of topics for the next half an hour or so. All right, Mark, it's up to you.
Thanks, David. So by way of background, I am a labor and employment attorney here at Foley and Lardner, and a recovering human resource manager before I became a lawyer. Since the onset of COVID, and once it became clear that a vaccine was being worked on, I've envisioned the day that would come once the vaccine was rolled out and multiple clients would call me on the phone and say, Mark, I need you to get me a nurse. I need you to get me 100 vials and have her or him come over here right away and shoot up my workforce. And Mark would say, well, I don't know if I can do that. And number two, Mark would say, well, what are you going to do if somebody says they're not going to take the vaccine? And of course, the answer I anticipate is I'm going to fire them. I can do that, can't I? From the last hour and a half, I think you should all realize now that when the vaccine comes out, employers on a general basis are not going to have ready access to this vaccine. But let's try to deal with some of the issues. So number one, can I make my employees get inoculated? And by way of background, I want to share with you a couple of facts, because the civil libertarians in the audience might say, well, the government can't make me get an injection of any substance, right? They can only encourage me. And that's wrong. There is a long history in the United States of government mandating inoculations in a wide variety of sources, including school children. If you want to go to school, public school, you have to get these certain vaccines. Immigrants, there's been a long history of this. Years ago, also, if you traveled to foreign countries and you wanted to get back into the country, you had to prove that you were properly inoculated. I recall as a child, my parents taking me to Mexico, and I had to get a smallpox vaccine. That was many, many, many years ago. And then there are certain states that have mandated flu vaccines and other hepatitis vaccines for certain healthcare workers. So the process has existed. There is an ability to do it, but they've been fairly limited as to the targets of the audience for where they were mandated. So one of the questions that arises is, given the current state of COVID in America, and if it gets worse in terms of the number and severity of cases, and if a vaccine gets rolled out, will state and local governments step in to pass laws? I point out state and local governments. Obviously, the federal government could do it. But regardless of which party or which candidate wins tomorrow, there seems to be a gross inability of the government in Washington to get their act together. And I don't think that's going to change regardless of who wins. But it may be a much easier lift for state and local governments to pass various laws. All of you should be attuned to that. And there's the 11th commandment. So I think you have to divide between public sector employers, where constitutional rights attach to each of the employees, and private sector employers, where employees have no constitutional rights generally. These are the issues that you will experience if you try to roll out a mandatory vaccine program. And that is, I've got a pre-existing condition. I can't take that vaccine. I don't want to take that vaccine, and making me take that vaccine could endanger my health because of blah, 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 fill in the blanks. And under the Americans with Disabilities Act and various companion state and local laws preventing disability discrimination, an employer in that situation would have an obligation to make a reasonable accommodation and to consider those factors in determining whether or not they're going to force the vaccine. You have religious and moral exemptions. based on Title VII and the other various state and local anti-discrimination laws, where people may be able to articulate a religious or moral ground for an exemption. Also, if you have a unionized workforce, depending upon the management rights clause in that collective bargaining agreement, you may have an obligation to bargain collectively with your union over any mandatory anything, including mandatory vaccines. Literally, as this program was starting today, I got an electronic newsletter from one of my labor and employment law sources, and it indicated that already the Service Employees International Union has entered into negotiations with some large hospital chains over how a COVID-19 vaccine will be handled under their respective collective bargaining agreements. You have workforce morale issues. If as a matter of law, I were to advise, yeah, you have the right to mandate inoculations and you have the right to terminate anybody who's unwilling, are you going to do that anyway, even though you legally can? And what's the morale impact to the workforce? Are you prepared to fire or terminate a large chunk of your workers? And we can learn from the past. Some of the issues wrapped up are because of the politicization of this whole COVID thing and the pandemic and the vaccines. Regardless of, depending upon who wins tomorrow, it's likely some employee is going to say, I'm not taking any Trump vaccine or I'm not taking any Biden vaccine. Additionally, let's look at what's happened historically under influenza, right? The flu vaccine has been around for years and years and years. It's generally regarded as safe. It's generally regarded as effective, although its effectiveness varies from year to year. And in the last year, I could find statistics, the 2018-2019 flu season, vaccination of adults was at 45.3%, which was a significant increase from prior years, but you're still only talking half of the population willing to step up and be inoculated. There have been public polling on will you take the COVID vaccine when it comes out? And the numbers I've been seeing have been running very consistently with this. So are you prepared to fire half your workforce who says, I'm not taking the vaccine? Those are the issues you have to deal with. This has been a very brief teaser. We at Foley fully intend to have a more focused only on labor and employment law matters vaccine webinar in the next couple of months, depending upon when the rollout occurs and we get other guidance from the government or possibly legislation from state and municipalities. With that, I'll turn it back over to David.
Well, thank you, Mark, and thank you, everybody. If everybody would just come back online with cameras and microphones, that would be really great, our other presenters. And I remind everyone that if you have questions that we can respond to, we're happy to do so. So with that, we have one question as to how long do we believe that it's going to take to vaccinate the U.S. population? Anybody want to venture a guess for that one?
A long time.
Well, I think you're right. Mike and Vanessa, there was a contract that was let between the government and one of the manufacturers for 4 million doses and things of that sort, but that isn't going to necessarily get everybody rolling, and I think they've tried to produce those things. Can you talk a little bit about that contract and how it came about, and what do you think if that contract's going to be challenged, or do we think there's going to be other contracts with other manufacturers?
Vanessa, did you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a bit more, I think, on the distribution side than perhaps the commercial contracting side, which would involve other suppliers that are going to need components and inputs into the supply chain. I think that obviously the commercial contracts and how long it's going to take companies to produce and get the deep freeze units out, the equipment out, the special vials for the glass, that's going to cause impacts and delays throughout. But for these initial contracts and who's receiving them first, that's a distribution question.
And of course, the main channel of distribution looks to be McKesson under the existing VFC addendum. I have a hard time, I'm not a government contracts lawyer. I have a hard time seeing government contracts challenge to that being brought or succeeding. There may be some commercial factors that affect that. One issue we really haven't talked about much, if at all, today is the fact that there could be more than, I mentioned there could be more than one vaccine, but there is more than one strain of the coronavirus. And depending upon how it's developed, it may be the case that there is a different vaccine for different strains. You know, according to press reports, for example, the so-called D strain has been most prevalent in Asia and the West Coast of the United States, whereas the more severe G strain is what has plagued Western Europe and those of us on the East Coast. And I think there's just too much uncertainty at this point to know whether there will be multiple vaccines, multiple channels of distribution, but it does look as if the delivery mechanism that was used with H1N1 will be the initial one here.
And Mike, do you have any idea, was the contract with McKesson, was that one that was put out for bid, or was that just awarded to them without anything?
Well, to answer that, we'd have to go pretty far back in time, and the short answer is I don't know the answer to that, but I would imagine that the underlying contract, the Vaccines for Children program contract, was originally bid competitively. That is in place and has been in place for quite some time. I don't know the details of that, but there was not a separate bidding process, as far as I know, for invoking this pandemic addendum, because it was already there.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So, Monica, you've been in a number of different settings and practiced in a number of different settings. We've talked a little bit about, the SOPs and things of that sort for maintaining the appropriate storage conditions and things of that sort, as well as specialized procedures for thawing those vaccines and things of that sort. How well do you think people are prepared, or do you think they need to do a little bit more work?
So I think that the providers and the health systems are, I believe that they're doing the best that they can right now. They are taking the information that is currently available, trying to anticipate, as Michael's saying, are there going to be multiple vaccines? How is this going to work? And I believe they're actually taking steps to identify the potential vendors, the potential equipment they're going to need, the refrigeration units, et cetera, so that they can be prepared when the time comes to receive and as efficiently as possible administer the vaccine to as many individuals as they can. I mean, the provider response to COVID has been, overwhelmingly good. We saw many, hospitals, health systems, providers have to quickly adjust, restructure operations, redeploy workforce to address COVID and try and treat patients. And we're seeing them now that we have been living in the COVID world, take a very active stance in trying to prepare as much as possible for the coming future.
Great. I think that, we all need to plan. We need to think about this right now, because it is going to happen, and we need to make sure that we have the infrastructure in place to provide vaccines to everyone who wants to get one or needs to get one without a doubt, and the priorities for that. We'll talk a little bit about the priorities because I think that's really important, the tiered approach to that situation. But we had another question in that came in about whether or not we think that the military is going to be involved in the administration and the distribution of the vaccine itself. As President Trump has mentioned on numerous occasions. What do you think about that? Do you think that the military it would be wise to utilize the infrastructure of the military to be able to help mass vaccinate the U.S. patient population?
David, before addressing the wisdom, or possibly without addressing the wisdom, as I mentioned earlier, the military was involved in the distribution of the H1N1 vaccine, but it was not used as a method of distributing the vaccine through the state channels. It was a parallel channel distribution used to immunize people in the military on military bases. And that, by all accounts, will definitely be part of any COVID-19 vaccine distribution system. Whether the military will be used, should be used, needs to be used for distribution to the civilian population, that remains to be seen. The military is not necessarily set up to distribute goods and services. There are a lot of infrastructures in place, not that the states or local governments have them either, but certainly in the private sector, there are a lot of distribution networks in place, transportation, logistics, storage of the type that you, Monica, and so we're talking about. Certainly, if there's a need to use the military to get vaccine to particular locations, that could happen. But I don't think it's contemplated that that would be the centerpiece of it at this point.
So I guess maybe, Monty, you can address this too. If there's 4 million doses that become available sooner than later, who do you think is going to get it first and why? And what's the order of priority?
Oh, thanks for the easy question there, David. Appreciate it. So
I'm known for throwing softballs, so I'll give you a second to think about that. How's that?
No, and it's a fair question, and it is, joking aside, it is a difficult question because of, there's ethical considerations, there's practical considerations, and it's going to be difficult. And I think at the end of the day, somebody's not going to be happy with the way it's handled. Personally, I really see some wisdom in the guidelines that the CDC has put out in terms of initially identifying what they call, the critical or the first grouping of people that should receive the vaccination. And I agree that would be, in my opinion, healthcare workers, people that we need to make sure remain healthy so that we have a healthcare force available to take care of people who do, contract the virus and who are sick, and also who are sick for other reasons. I mean, we're dealing, with cancer and other diseases. We need to have a healthcare force that is, able to treat patients. And then I think you have to focus on, other essential workers and people who are really at the highest risk to contract the disease and not do well with it. People with underlying existing health conditions. We've seen, higher mortality rates in people who do have those underlying health conditions, who, meet, certain, have certain, fall within certain health criteria. So in my mind, when there's a first initial limited distribution, and I do agree that, with what Michael said, in terms of, the military, needing to receive the vaccinations, that would be my thought process for developing those protocols.
So, Mr. Newberger, okay, so the vaccine's only 70% effective, perhaps, and we might need to have more than one dose. And Foley says to me, David, you got to return back to the office and you got to take the vaccine. And I say, I'm not taking anything with that level of effectiveness. What's going to happen to me?
In your case, I would recommend termination, but in most other cases, it's a very difficult decision because you have to drill down to, is your reason for refusing one of a specific and verifiable pre-existing condition, or is it emotionality? And even then, like I said, morale issues play into this. And can your feelings and about it be accommodated? We know in America, there's, a big swath of anti-vaxxers, right? People who are just convinced that vaccines cause all kinds of horrible conditions to children, and have refused to have their kids vaccinated. There is no easy answer for this. I think one of the things that I didn't mention, I think for sure we're going to see is liability protections legislated. If the government concludes we want to really force vaccination and get as many people covered, employers and other providers are going to say, okay, I don't want to get sued if something happens. Now, employers are already protected to a large extent by workers' compensation. And so an employer who follows reasonable standards shouldn't be subject to a tort suit, but channeled that claim, if any, through workers' comp, i.e. that they were injured because my employer made me take a vaccine and then I suffered consequences. But as we've seen with COVID generally, some of the states have already passed waivers of liability laws. And I got to believe if the government concludes we really want to get behind vaccination, there will be additional waivers of liability. But to get back to your original question, it's a fine dance. And your situation is going to be different than my situation, might be different than Monica's situation.
Sure. Well, there is a federal vaccine injury compensation program. Unfortunately, at present, COVID-19 isn't part of that program. We've had another question about, whether or not there are going to be additional legislative efforts to add or to address the COVID-19 vaccine. Anybody have any thoughts on whether or not we're likely to see that right now or in the near future?
Well, as I've noted, it depends who the population is. If COVID continues to bloom, right, you can easily see how states would pass an add-on to the inoculation programs presently in place for school children. That's an easy add-on. There's a history there, there's a practice, there's an enforcement, and just to add it in with hepatitis or mumps, measles, rubella, whatever they are, I forget which ones they are, that would be an easy add-on. But extending it to other portions of society, a state or local government could pass a mandate saying first responders have to get it for the reasons Monica's talking about, why it should be a priority for healthcare workers.
Yeah, I would.
It's also, I'd say, David, it's also foreseeable that there could be legislation to address immunity. The American way with traditional distribution is to sue everybody in the distribution chain. So in this case, it wouldn't just be the employer mandating it. It could be the manufacturer, it could be the distributor, it could be distributors or immunization centers. And for people to participate in it at those various chains, they may well demand immunity, and you can see the possibility of that. It would be most effective, obviously, at the federal level, but if Congress is as slow as it has been on a lot of issues, it's not unforeseeable that the states might step in, or some of them might.
So that would be immunity from any tort liabilities if people were injured for taking the vaccine. That's what I believe you're talking about, Mike. Is that correct?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, and as I said before, there is a national vaccine injury compensation program that I think that Congress would probably think about amending to provide, if people were injured in the course of taking the COVID-19 vaccine, that they could get compensation through that. But that would take another act of Congress. And, given where we are right now in the election cycle and what could change, who knows what's going to happen in the very near future, that's for sure. So, Anybody, any other last comments or any other last issues that people want to raise for the group? Well, I guess with that, I want to thank everybody for participating today and for sticking with us. If you'd like a copy of the slides from today, if you send our team an email, you can get a copy of the slides if you're so inclined. And all of us are here and are available to respond to questions and comments. You can find our email addresses on the Foley.com website. It's really our first initial last name at Foley.com. So with that, again, thank you very much. We appreciate your time and attention today. We want you to all stay safe and stay healthy, number one, and get out there and vote. Very important. With that, I think we're going to close. So thank you again very much.
Oh, thank you.